It was a typical night for Captain Marcus Johnson, who had just finished his shift and was driving home after hours of intense work at the precinct. As the head of his unit, a lot of responsibilities fell on his shoulders, and he had just spent the last several hours coordinating teams, handling paperwork, and responding to high-stress incidents. His muscles ached, his eyes were heavy, and his mind was focused only on one thing: getting home. Marcus wasn't thinking about the route he took. He was just looking for the quickest way back to his house. The less busy side streets, though dimly lit, seemed like a good option to avoid traffic. The neighborhood he was passing through wasn't known for its safety, especially at night, but that wasn't a concern for Marcus. After all, he was the law here, or so he thought. As Marcus approached a quiet intersection, the flash of police lights suddenly appeared behind him. The red and blue beams cut through the darkness like a warning. He glanced into the rearview mirror, confusion creeping across his face. He hadn't broken any laws, he wasn't speeding, and there was no other traffic around. Why was he being pulled over? He slowed his car to the side of the road and came to a stop. Sighing heavily, Marcus leaned back in his seat. His first instinct was to think this was just a routine stop, but deep down, he knew better. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize racial profiling when he saw it. Even as a captain, he wasn't immune to this kind of treatment. The shiny black sedan he was driving probably didn't help. It was a car that screamed successful, but in the wrong neighborhood, it screamed suspicious. His heart raced slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar frustration he had felt so many times before. He had risen through the ranks, earned his position through hard work, yet here he was, just another black man stopped on a dark road. The officer exited his patrol car and approached Marcus's vehicle. The harsh beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, blinding him for a second before it was directed into the interior of the car. The officer didn't waste time with pleasantries. "License and registration," the officer snapped, his voice harsh and authoritative. The flashlight hovered near Marcus's face, its bright light still probing his features as if looking for guilt. Marcus's chest tightened. He knew the drill. Moving slowly, making sure his hands were always visible, he reached over to the glove compartment and retrieved his documents. His movements were deliberate and calm, even though inside he was seething. The officer, a white man with a thick mustache and a face weathered from years on the job, didn't even glance at Marcus's paperwork. His focus was on something else, something much deeper. "You in a hurry to get somewhere?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this time of night?" Marcus, fighting to keep his voice steady, replied, "I'm just on my way home from work, officer." The officer squinted, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something incriminating. "Work, huh? And what kind of work do you do?" "I'm a police officer," Marcus said calmly, trying not to escalate the situation. "Captain Marcus Johnson, head of Precinct 27. For a moment the officer blinked, as if the words didn't register. Then a slow smile crept onto his face, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the smile of someone who didn't care. "Is that so?" The officer sneered. "Well, Captain, it doesn't matter what title you've got. Right now you're under investigation, so keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew what this was. The officer didn't care that he was law enforcement. He only saw a black man in a car that, in his mind, didn't belong to him. Marcus could tell that trying to explain further wasn't going to help, but he needed to keep his cool. "Officer, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus began. But before he could finish, the officer reached for his radio, already calling for backup. "Requesting additional units. We've got a possible suspect here, uncooperative," the officer said, his voice calm but cold. Marcus knew what was happening. He had seen this play out too many times, though never from this side of the badge. The situation was about to spiral, and it wasn't just about following procedure anymore. It was about power. It was about who controlled the narrative. Minutes later, the sound of more sirens echoed down the street, bouncing off the buildings and filling the empty night. 3 more patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing like a warning to the world. As the additional officers stepped out of their vehicles, the situation took on a new layer of intensity. They weren't here to assess the situation. They were here to assert control. Marcus watched as the officers approached, hands resting near their holsters, faces set in grim determination. He could feel the tension thickening in the air. This wasn't about enforcing the law anymore. This was a test of wills. Would Marcus, the black man, submit to their authority? The officer who had pulled him over stepped back as one of the new arrivals. A young white man fresh out of the academy approached Marcus's car. As soon as he got close enough to see Marcus's face, the young officer's eyes widened in recognition. "Wait. I know him," the young officer said, glancing nervously at his partner. "That's Captain Johnson. He's our new commanding officer." The tension in the air shifted, but only slightly. Marcus could see the young officer trying to reconcile what was happening. His partner, however, wasn't backing down. "I don't care if he's the president," the original officer snapped. "He's acting suspicious. We need to treat this by the book." The young officer hesitated, clearly conflicted. He had been taught to respect authority, but this was a different kind of authority. This was a man who outranked all of them, yet was being treated like a criminal. "Sir, maybe we should reconsider. I mean, he's our captain." "Shut up and follow orders," the senior officer barked. His voice was filled with an undercurrent of rage, and for a split second, Marcus could see the deep-seated hatred lurking beneath the surface. Realizing that the situation was quickly becoming dangerous, Marcus decided to take control before things escalated any further. He reached for his phone, intending to call the precinct commander and explain the situation. But the moment his hand moved, the officer's reaction was instant. "Gun! He's reaching for a gun!" the officer screamed. Before Marcus could say a word, the officer swung his baton, striking Marcus across the shoulder with a sickening thud. The pain was immediate, but it wasn't the physical blow that hit hardest. It was the realization that, in the eyes of this officer, Marcus was nothing more than a threat. Chaos erupted. The younger officer, horrified by what he was witnessing, stepped in, trying to pull the senior officer back. "Stop! He wasn't reaching for anything. He's unarmed," the younger officer shouted, his voice desperate. But the senior officer was beyond reasoning. His face twisted with anger, and he shoved the younger man aside. "This guy thinks he's above the law. He's not getting out of this," the officer growled, pulling out his handcuffs and moving toward Marcus, who was still reeling from the blow. Marcus, struggling to remain composed, said, "I'm a captain. You can't just—" "I can do whatever the hell I want," the officer spat, eyes wild with fury. As the scene descended into chaos, more officers arrived, including the precinct commander, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness. She took one look at the scene, Marcus on the ground, the officers circling like vultures, and immediately knew something was wrong. "Everyone stand down," she ordered, her voice cutting through the noise. The officers hesitated, but eventually backed off. The senior officer, still seething, glared at Marcus with a mix of contempt and disbelief. "Commander, this guy was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job," he protested, his voice less confident than before. The commander ignored him and approached Marcus, helping him to his feet. "Captain Johnson, are you all right?" Marcus nodded, wincing slightly from the pain in his shoulder. "I'm fine, but this needs to stop." The commander turned to the senior officer. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon." For a moment, the officer looked like he might argue, but the look in the commander's eyes told him there was no point. He slowly unfastened his badge, his face red with anger, and handed it over. The commander's face was a mask of calm fury. "I'll be filing a full report on this incident, and believe me, this won't be swept under the rug." Just when it seemed like things were finally calming down, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his lawyer. "Marcus, we've got a problem," the voice on the other end said. "The officer's family is filing a lawsuit against you for assault. They're claiming you provoked him." Marcus closed his eyes, his heart sinking. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. To make matters worse, within hours, the story was all over the news. But the headlines were skewed, turning Marcus from the victim into the villain. "Captain attacks officer in racially charged incident," the headlines screamed. The media was twisting the facts, and Marcus knew that clearing his name was going to be a fight. The story reached its conclusion in the courtroom. Marcus, along with his legal team, presented irrefutable evidence that the officer had been in the wrong. There were witnesses, body cam footage, and even the testimony of the young officer who had tried to stop the assault. The officer was found guilty of misconduct, and the lawsuit was dropped, but the damage to Marcus's reputation had been done. The case had exposed the deep-seated issues within the police department, and Marcus realized that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to flourish for far too long. In the end, Marcus wasn't just fighting for his own justice. He was fighting to change the entire system. He vowed to lead the charge for police reform, to root out the racism and corruption that had tainted the force for too long.